All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our writing workshop here today of science, technology, and bioeconomy policy. Really excited to welcome our speakers that we have here with us today. We have Dr. Sarah Carter, we have Dr. Julietta Shang, and Dr. Emily Arond. And so I know on the program that we were supposed to have Dr. Najas Jeffrey join us. She was unable to make it last minute, but we'll see if we can involve her in future events, as we'd love to hear her perspective. But quick introductions before we go ahead and get started. So I'm going to put my screen up here. Just a minute. Sure. All right. How is that looking for folks?
Great.
Looking good? Great. Cool. So some quick introductions. So first of all, we have Dr. Sarah Carter with us, who's principal at Science Policy Consulting, where she focuses on societal and policy implications of emerging biotechnologies, including issues of responsible innovation, biosafety, and biosecurity. She's currently focusing on issues such as the advanced biotechnologies industry, synthetic biology, and DNA sequence screening, as well as international norms for biosecurity. So she has previously worked with folks such as the Policy Center of the J. Craig Venter Institute and at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. She's a former AAAS Science and Technology Fellow and a former Mersenne Science and Technology Fellow at the National Academies. She earned her PhD at the University of California, San Francisco, and her bachelor's at Duke University. Also want to welcome here Dr. Emily Arond as the Director of Road Mapping and Education at EBRC and the Executive Editor of EBRC's Technical Research Roadmaps, which we're going to go and talk a little bit about in this, because if anyone here on the call is going to be really interested in submitting to our special issue with JSPG and EBRC, that's a really great place for you guys to look for information. So we'll be going over that in a bit. Emily created and led the EBRC Industry Internship Program and leads the EBRC SEE Outreach and Education Project, which includes a collaboration with the Tumble Science Podcast for Kids to create the Life Lab podcast series about engineering biology. Emily also leads the EBRC's Science Policy Communications, contributes and reports on funding and grant support, and also oversees and manages the EBRC website. Prior to EBRC, Emily was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the National Science Foundation in the Division of Chemical, Bioengineering, Environmental, and Transport Systems, where she focused on issues such as synthetic biology and biomanufacturing. She received her Bachelor of Science in Biomedical Science from Colorado State University and a PhD in Neuroscience from University of Colorado. She then continued her academic training in Trieste, my Italian is terrible, Italy, with a neuroengineering postdoctoral fellowship in the International School for Advanced Studies. And next, I also want to welcome to our program here today, Dr. Julietta Shang. She's a science policy postdoc at the Engineering Biology Research Consortium. Prior to EBRC, she was a junior fellow at Colorado State University in collaboration with Mass General Hospital in Boston, and where she partnered with bioengineers, clinicians, and academics on research to identify scientific challenges and develop creative solutions in biology research. She recently earned her PhD in biomedical sciences and neuroscience from Colorado State University with a focus on sex differences in the brain and body that lead to neuropsychiatric disorders. So welcome everyone here to the program, and I think we will get started with our presentation here. So a little bit, because some of our folks here on the call may be new to JSPG and EBRC, I just want to talk a little bit about our respective organizations and then lead into some information about this special issue. So first of all, we are kicking off here the Advancing Science and Technology Policy for the Next-Generation Bioeconomy special issue. We'll be touching on this a few times in the presentation, but the submission deadline for this is going to be January 13th. So be thinking about your articles and be thinking about who you may be wanting to write them with and on what topics over the upcoming weeks and months. So a bit about JSPG. JSPG, we are a nonprofit that works to catalyze the engagement of students and early career researchers in science policy and governance through research policy and writing. We are more than just a journal, though. We are also working to host events, trainings, and professional development opportunities for folks that are part of the journal. And we also really want to be that vehicle for and enabling early career scientists and students to publish their work in a peer-reviewed journal on issues of science policy and science communication. So we're also going to be looking to have folks contribute, papers, events, on issues that are not just policy for a single country or a single place. We are an international organization, and so we really welcome folks who are from all over the world to be thinking about how science can affect policy at an international level, as well as a local and regional level as well. So a little bit about some of the opportunities at JSPG, because I mentioned that we aren't just a journal. We host events like this writing workshop. We host webinars and panels for career development. We also are always looking for volunteers on our editorial board and our staff. And we also have our ambassador program for folks who are currently students who are wanting to engage more in science policy work at JSPG. Our authors have also gone on to present at conferences and meetings about their work. So it can be a really great jumping off point if this is something where you would like to be sharing this kind of work with others in your field and across science. So I'm going to turn it over to Emily here to talk a little bit about EBRC.
Thanks, Hannah. So EBRC is the Engineering Biology Research Consortium. We are a small nonprofit organization that is really kind of a interesting mix between a think tank, but not really being a think tank, and a scientific society without being a scientific society. We are a membership organization, and we're really driven, the work that we do is driven by those members. And I'll mention those again in just a minute, but Hannah, if you want to go to the next slide. Yeah. So we are really committed to advancing engineering biology to address national and global needs. So that is anything in the world of engineering microbes, genetic engineering, metabolic engineering, thinking about engineering human cells, engineering plants, for various different uses. And that ranges everything from food and agriculture to health and medicine to industrial biotechnology and biomanufacturing. Next slide, Hannah. Thanks. Yeah, you can just hop those all up there. So we do a variety of different things. As I mentioned, we are member driven. So we have academic members that come from institutions, research institutions, primarily around the United States and around the world, as well as biotechnology industry companies that participate as members. And importantly, especially for this audience, we have a nearly 300-member student and postdoc association, which is a great group of students that are really engaged and invested in engineering biology and biotechnology and are looking for lots of different opportunities in career development, workforce opportunities, as well as just networking and communications with other students and postdocs in this research field. So as Hannah mentioned, we do research road mapping, and she said we'll talk about the roadmaps. These technical research roadmaps, and I'm going to spit a URL at you, it's roadmap.ebrc.org. All of those can be a great reference as to some exciting technology that's happening in the field of engineering biology and related fields, and kind of give a vision of what those technologies might look like 20 to 30 years in the future. So you might check those out if you're maybe a little less familiar with engineering biology and biotechnology as far as kind of what's coming and what opportunities exist. So EBRC also looks at education and workforce development, security and safety, and policy and international engagement. We also have activities, as you see at the bottom of the slide here, on responsible innovation and ethics and bioethics, DEIA, the bioeconomy, and some fun themes coming up for the next year, including thinking about global impacts and cooperation, collaboration in terms of research. In engineering biology, the convergence of engineering biology with artificial intelligence, and research to application, meaning how can we implement how can we innovate in engineering biology so that it's really driven by applications and meeting those global and national needs. Thanks, Hannah.
That's great. All right, so I'm going to go in a little bit of the nitty-gritty about this special issue. What do you need to know about submitting? What kind of articles are we looking for? Just kind of some of the nitty-gritty of what we're looking for with this special issue. So for the bioeconomy special issue, first of all, kind of broad strokes, like what are we looking for here? I wanted to highlight some comments from India Hook-Barnard of EBRC, which I thought I saw her join. I don't know if she's on, I can't see her on my screen, but oh, hi, India. Wanted to highlight your quote here of, engineering biology and biotechnologies can really revolutionize these approaches to tackling some of these really big issues, such as global food shortages, mitigating the climate crisis sustainably and responsibly, and ensuring that even the most remote and resource-limited environments have access to life-saving materials and medicines. So if any of those really big kind of topics grab you, those are some things that we might be looking for in articles that are coming in for the special issue. Also from Julianne McCall of JSPG, one of the things that she really highlighted in her kind of introductory quote on this special issue is really we're wanting to provide a platform for folks who are early in their careers, for fellows, students, to really think about what does the future hold for the bioeconomy. And then what kinds of forward-thinking policy ideas can we put forward, and what kind of analyses for the practical use by leading policymakers it can be used to help navigate this rapidly evolving landscape in the bioeconomy. So for this special issue, like I said a little bit from there, these topics we're looking for are going to be on ideas such as, new policy ideas, challenges facing the bioeconomy, and then, this could include things such as biology and biotechnology and AI and machine learning and how those things intersect, biomanufacturing, how do we scale up our bioeconomy, food and agriculture, energy, biodiversity, biosecurity, biotechnology regulations, and workforce development. So it's quite a big list and hopefully gets a few ideas running for all of you during this presentation. Also, we're looking at 4 articles that are addressing this issue specifically at a global or a local or regional economic level. So are you looking at it and the big, how it's going to affect the world, or how it can affect a local or regional community? Once again, submission deadline, January 13th of 2025. So some article formats of what we're looking for. So they could be policy memos, and you can find all this information on our website. I just want to highlight it here for what types of articles we'll be taking for this article, for this issue. Policy memos, policy position papers, research-based op-eds, other articles that are addressing bioeconomy policy. This could range from fact sheets, technology assessments, policy analyses, workshop reports, or book reviews. If you have questions on this, please reach out to our team. You can find all that information on our website, and we'd love to chat with you about what your ideas are. So who can publish in JSPG? Our criteria is that at least half of the authors must meet one of the following conditions. So either current students or folks who have recently graduated, postdocs or recent postdocs, current policy fellows or recent fellows within 10 years, or early career professionals who are within 10 years of full-time professional work. We want to be really inclusive of people who are in different stages of their career, who may be new to the policy world, but may still be in that early career stage, or someone who's made a transition, or may still be a student in training. So we're encouraging submissions from folks from around the international community and also those with expertise in a wide range of disciplines. You may not be an expert in the bioeconomy. That is perfectly okay. But if this is something that you're interested in writing about or learning more about, this can be a really great opportunity for you to really dive into this topic. You can have senior individuals as co-authors on submissions with other eligible individuals, but we do ask that the students or early career scholars be listed as the primary authors. And then, of course, like I said earlier, at least half of the co-authors have to fit one of the eligibility criteria. So what's the review process for this going to be? So all submissions will be peer reviewed by our editorial board at JSPG, and then accepted articles will then be entered into a policy paper competition where a committee of experts in biotechnology and bioeconomy policy will select the top 3 articles. So first, second, and third place winners will be awarded registration and travel support to the 2025 EBRC annual meeting of up to $800. So if that's a meeting that you've been wanting to attend, but maybe it just wasn't an option for you, this is a great way for you to get to the EBRC meeting and learn from a lot of really great experts and folks who have been working in this field for a long time. And then EBRC, we also wanted to point out EBRC is a sponsor, but they're not going to be responsible for the content of the special issue. So just putting that disclaimer out there. So before I move on, I can't see what's in the chat, but do we have any questions about some of the logistics of submitting articles for this special issue? You can ask at the end too if you need to think. So I'm going to move on then to the basics of science policy writing. So I'm going to give an overview of kind of what makes for a strong article in science policy, and then we're going to narrow it down a little bit towards looking at bioeconomy. So first, science policy writing at large. What is it? Why is it important? I think as scientists, I'm a scientist myself. We're often very, very focused on our field. But one of the things is that science, even the most basic fundamental science, it has some sort of application to broader society. And so science policy is really about public policy governing matters of science. It can be rules, regulations, practices, guidelines that are either affecting research or being informed by researchers and scientists. Another thing I always like to point out in this is that I think a lot of people, when they think of science policy, they think because the word science is there and because scientists are involved, that it's going to be a very logical, very methodological process. Good policy should be based on evidence, but the process of science policy is not going to always be scientific. There's going to be a lot of different people who are going to be contributing to the field of science policy. There's going to be a lot of different voices in there. And it's not always going to be the most logical process. So just because the word science is in there does not mean it's going to be necessarily a science in and of itself. And then one thing to note is that you can have a great idea based on your science of how you think a policy should be run. Science is not policy prescriptive. Science can inform policy, but there's going to be a lot more than just scientific data that goes into making good policy. And we're going to talk a little bit about that during this presentation. It's really only, like I said, it's really only one voice. There's going to be a lot of other communities and a lot of other factors when it comes to decision-making and governance around science or that is using science as part of its evidence. And then a point here, most of the people who are making science policy are not scientists. Most people in government, are not scientists by training. There's going to be a lot of folks who maybe are experts in policy, but not in science. And you want a mix of people in the room. You want scientists, you want engineers, you want technical experts, but you also want people who have their expertise in policy also contributing to that discussion. So it's important that scientists be in the room. But I can tell you, as someone who works with both scientists and policymakers, you definitely don't want only scientists in the room. You need a mix of folks there who are all contributing to this discussion. So something you'll hear in a lot of these kinds of presentations is this idea of policy for science versus science for policy. And a little bit about what that distinction is. Sometimes they can kind of blur together, but in general, policy for science is to set decisions on how to fund or structure scientific research. So it's policies that are going to impact how science is done. And then you have science for policy. So this is where science is being used to help inform good governance and good policy. And, one thing just kind of on that, I think sometimes people, when they think of science and policy getting together, it seems like it's muddying the waters of science. Science should inform policymakers, but politics should never influence scientific integrity and results. That's just something that, I think it's really critical to make sure that we have that distinction where scientists are there to be advisors, to inform policymakers, but at the end of the day, scientific results should be what are driving, scientific results. That's just an important distinction to always make in science policy. So who's writing about science policy? We have our articles that we are publishing in JSPG, but who out in the, in their professional careers is out there writing these memos and briefs? So it's going to be folks who are both enactors and influencers in policy. So enactors in American policy, at least, it could be the White House. In other countries, it could be their own form of executive government. It could be agencies, it could be ministries, or it could be legislatures as well. You are going to have people who are then also wanting to influence policy. So not just the people who are the actual ones making the policies, but people who want to influence it. So that could be universities. In my day job, I work for MIT, and this is something that I do quite a bit, where I'm working on science policy issues affecting our researchers at MIT. You can have think tanks. You can have foundations, advisory groups, advocacy coalitions who are wanting to advocate on a certain topic. All of them might be writing these kinds of science policy documents. So what are some, as you're thinking about when you're going to write your article for this journal, or just if you're thinking about this field more generally, what are some different levers that you can pull to influence policy? So you could, for example, create, expand, reform, or remove a program or initiative. If you want to think, I have a really great idea for we need to create this new program, that could be something that could be proposed. Or you could say we need to change it. It's not working how it is now. What ways can we change it? You can we can set a goal or propose a metric to evaluate process. Is there something where we need more data before we can decide on what a good policy decision is? You could say we want to conduct a study on this issue in order to help inform policy. You could say we're going to adopt, revise, or eliminate a policy or regulation, something that, is already in law that you think should be revised or moved or added. You can also develop and upgrade infrastructure. So if you have, if you think there really needs to be more research done on a certain topic, is there currently the scientific infrastructure to do it? And if not, you can look to see if there's a role for a governing body to help make that build up that infrastructure or provide resources. And similarly, you can also, not just infrastructure, also look at resources, whether it be funding, whether it be incentives. All of those things are things that can also influence how science is done, or science can help inform. So through budgets, collaborations, new authorities or limitations, all of these are things that can be considered as different policy levers that you can propose in your article. So writing for policy versus writing for scientists. Many people who are thinking about writing for JSPG are, many of them are scientists, whether trainees or early career, who may be very used to writing for other scientists. So when you're writing for science, your audience is going to be other researchers. You're going to be testing a hypothesis, or you're going to be presenting new scientific findings, or you're going to be summarizing scientific findings. And in the format, you're going to start very broad. You're going to start like, here is the field of research. I'm going to get my results and I'm going to synthesize it down into this is what my conclusion is. You're going to have a lot of data. You're going to demonstrate how you did all your statistics. You're going to be very detailed in how you are presenting your findings. And then your tone is going to be very field specific. You're going to use very academic language, and you're going to want to be very specific in how you are referring to to different aspects of your field. This is very much kind of a upside down triangle. You're starting broad and you're getting really narrow. Policy writing is going to be pretty much the opposite. So your audience is going to be not just other experts in your field, it's going to be policymakers, it's going to be the public, it's going to be folks who maybe have never even heard of your specific topic that you're going to be writing about. And your goal is going to be really to inform about what kinds of options are there for policy. You might be trying to persuade someone to support a policy recommendation. So it's going to be a very different kind of goal in your writing than in academic writing. Your format is going to be very concise. You're going to start with your big picture right up front. Like your first 1 or 2 sentences is basically going to be the conclusion, essentially, of what you are looking for. You're going to start with the big picture right up front. And in terms of data, so if you do have data, findings, figures to back up what you are proposing, you want to be very selective in what you are presenting. You want to make sure that if you have a figure, if you have a piece of data, that the reason you're including it is because it is going to be useful and informative to your audience. You don't want to throw a bunch of facts and figures out there that are just going to confuse people or kind of muddy the water. You want to be accurate. You want to make sure that you are presenting things in a way that's truthful, but you want to make sure that when you are presenting any kind of data, that you are doing so in a way that's very clear and very focused in on the point that you're trying to convey. And then your tone, you're going to want to be very clear in your language. You want to make sure that it's accessible and avoid scientific jargon as much as possible. So here you're going to start with your conclusions, and then you're going to broaden out when you're talking about we have different options. So it's that reversal of the triangle. So I think, when we're talking about this, it seems like these are 2 very different worlds. So where is that common ground between how scientists and policymakers can really convene? And I think one of the things that I like to bring up is that when you're talking with science or you're talking with policy, it's always going to be building on prior knowledge in law. When you are in science, you're always building on existing literature. In policy, you're always going to be building on what is the current legal or policy landscape that you're currently in. And it's going to be incremental progress. You can have a really great policy idea based on your science, but it may not be feasible right now. There may be a lot of steps that need to happen in between before you get there. So it's going to be the same in science as it is in policy. I like this one because quite often science, you're doing a lot of, initial testing. You're kind of trying to get get some of the preliminary data. And then all of a sudden you hit a moment where things start to, you start getting a lot of data. It starts going fast. It's similar in policy where things can be kind of a slog until they're not. And I think one thing that, many scientists like to say is like, I'm being very objective. I have my data. Yes, like science should be objective. That is the goal. But ultimately, how you decide what to study, how we decide what's funded, all of these things are based on values and interest. So while your data should be objective, what you're choosing to study and why you're studying it is, and to some degree, based on what kind of values you have and what sort of interest. And that's going to be similar in policy. And then one thing I also like to remind folks in policy and science is that it's often staffers and trainees who are going to be the change makers. So when you are in a lab, who knows what's going on day to day in the lab? It's going to be the students, the postdocs, the staff in the lab. When you're going to an agency or a member of the legislature, who are the people who are doing all of the work behind the scenes? It's the staffers. So if you are writing your policy paper and you want to find out like what actually is going on in in government or in in an organization on this issue, if you can find contact information for folks who are on the ground doing this work, they might be a great resource for you to help inform some of the proposals that you're putting out in your policy document for submission to the article. So I just want to put that out there. And then also, I think one thing is that scientists, we're aiming to make the world a better place. And then you'll find quite often, there might be disagreements even within the scientific community on how things are being interpreted or how things are being selected or done. You're going to have that in policy too. Folks are, they're trying to make things better in their view. They may just disagree how to get there. So we're going to look at in policy writing. I have a few things that I just like to say as like in policy writing, one of the last things you want is for your memo, your paper to kind of look like this visual here. You want to make sure that you are not leaving your reader looking at something that is confusing, that's overwhelming. You want to be very clear. You're going to want to be brief. You want to be feasible. You want to make sure that the things that you're proposing in your policy paper are things that can actually be done. And you want to be relevant. You want to make sure that you're proposing ideas that are, important to people, that are going to make a difference. And then you want to be timely. There might be a great idea that, came up 10, 15 years ago. People might not be as interested in it now, but if you think that if you think it's still a good idea and you want to bring it up, that is something that timing is everything. So just be considering that as you're writing. Just a minute. It's not letting me go. All right. And then be accurate. This is something that I think in policy sometimes even scientists can sometimes get swept up in certain kinds of, policy ideas of the day. One of the things I always like to say is like, take a step back, make sure you're really relying on what is the data and the sources that you're pulling from, like, what are they trying to say? And just make sure that you're being really accurate in how you're portraying that, because all it can take is, I think we're seeing this across the world now, is this, there's kind of a distrust of science and institutions. And we want to make sure that we are being trustworthy messengers on issues of science and technology policy. And then I think one thing also is you want to be trustworthy, but you also want to be convincing. And so you want to make sure that you are portraying the facts, but also why they matter, and why your reader should listen to what you're presenting. So a few questions for you all to ask while you're writing a policy memo. So is it relevant? Is it persuasive? Is it understandable? Are these recommendations, are they feasible? And then feasible in multiple different avenues. Is the scientific data also supporting other policy options? Are there other options that the data might also lend itself to? And be thinking about pros and cons. There's never going to be a single policy solution that is going to be the one ideal policy solution. There's always going to be a give and take. So just be thinking about that as you're writing. And then what other stakeholders are also engaging in or affected by this issue, and what the perspective might they be offering that might be different than the one you are. And then are you emphasizing the importance of the issue? I think like that's one thing to really kind of hit home, is you can have, a really technically sound idea, but you want to make sure that you are convincing people about why it's important. And then make sure that you are staying as narrowly focused on your idea that you want to convey, and you aren't getting bogged down by unnecessary details. So everything you write, everything you include, make sure that it is going to be useful in your argument that you're trying to make during while you're writing. So I want to go over an example of kind of what does a policy memo format look like. So we have an executive summary where this is almost like an abstract of what you are going to be in an academic paper. But you're going to start with what is the key thing that you want to solve, and what are your key recommendations? And that's all going to be there in your executive summary. So in this example here of Georgia's maternal mortality rate is one of the highest in the US and shows few signs of improvement. That demonstrates right there that this is an important issue that needs that your reader needs to pay attention to. And then you can, quickly read and see that you think that these authors think that they would like that an amendment to the Georgia legal code that allows certified nurse midwives to practice independently could help to solve this issue. So you can see pretty quickly just by skimming through it what the key issue is and how they think they want to address it. And then you have your background. You're going to see, in this example, they did include a figure, and you're going to see that it's a very easy to read figure. So it's, it's not bogged down in too many details, but it's very clear. And you can see where is there a rural doctor shortage with or without OBGYNs. And you can see that, kind of there's significant parts of the state that are having this issue. So if you're going to include a figure, make sure it's clear and make sure it really drives home the message that you're trying to drive home. Then they list a series of different options of how different kinds of policies that could address this issue. So one would be amending the Georgia Code to increase the certified nurse midwives to allow for independent practice. They list the advantages and disadvantages of this policy proposal. Then they give a second option that also has advantages and disadvantages. And then at the very end, they're saying, like, here's our policy recommendation of what we think is the best option in this scenario. So I wanted to also provide some additional resources for you guys to check out. So first of all, our JSPG workshops and training resources. You can find all of these, a lot of documents on our website on this. You can also check out our YouTube channel for past writing workshops. And you're here today, so. But also, these can really kind of provide opportunities for you to think about science policy writing, as well as see some examples to help in your own writing. So a few resources that might just be helpful for you guys on like general science policy. There's the textbook Beyond Sputnik, U.S. Science Policy in the 21st Century, Issues in Science and Technology, the National Science Policy Network, American Association for the Advancement of Science, and then also for folks who might be considering careers in this field, the California Council on Science and Technology. It does have a guide for science policy, a career guide to policy careers for scientists. So a few resources for you guys to check out. So next, I want to go over some basics of the bioeconomy. So first of all, what is it? I will say there's no universal definition of the bioeconomy. This is something that is still being very much debated and talked about in the field of how do we define it. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development does define it as the set of economic activities in which biotechnology contributes centrally to primary production and industry. The National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine here in the US defines it as economic activity driven by research and innovation in the life sciences and biotechnology, and that is enabled by technological advances in engineering and in computing and information sciences. So you can see there's some differences in like how we're defining it. But I think, one thing that I want to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit about is when we're talking about terminology in the bioeconomy, different terms can be interpreted or used in very different ways. And I think Sarah had some points that she wanted to add on that.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I see you pulling up my my little notes there. Yeah, the bioeconomy is one of those big words that means different things to different people. And it is, when you are using that term, when you first introduce it, and no matter what kind of context you're in, if it's if you're giving a webinar, or if you're writing a paper, or if you're using it in some other context, you need to say exactly how you define it. And when I am writing about it, I often use that National Academy's definition that Hannah mentioned. But one thing that I have found, especially in the past couple of years, there's been a lot of U.S. government activity about the bioeconomy after the executive order in September of 2022 that was focused on the bioeconomy. But when as part of some work I was doing with the Federation of American Scientists and with NASISH, we went and we talked to all these different agencies about how they were defining the bioeconomy. And we found out that even within the US government, there were all these different definitions and ideas about it, including some of the things I outlined here. Is it specific to an economic sector or not? Is it specific to genetically engineered organisms? In a lot of places, especially if you go internationally, it is not. It is something that's more broadly things that are dependent on living systems more generally. You know, all of agriculture would be considered part of the bioeconomy in a lot of places. Is biomanufacturing, you know, a synonym of these things? That's something that often comes across as one of the more closely tied terms to the bioeconomy. And then biomass, or people in the sort of sustainable fuels area. Like sometimes if you can ask a question that says, how big is the bioeconomy? And I've heard an answer that came back saying, oh, in the US, there's 1 trillion tons of biomass that we produce a year. And you know, and it was a little bit shocking to hear that answer, because in that person said the bioeconomy was about that biomass. And there's just very different perspectives about that within the US government, within the country, and, you know, within you know, certainly around the world, it gets even worse. The rest of these terms, I'll just go through a little bit quickly. Sustainability is something that you have to, you know, do you mean economic sustainability or environmental sustainability? When you're using that, is it just kind of a heuristic, kind of a goal, or are you really going to start talking about, you know, full life cycle analyses and carbon footprints and things like, you know, you need to sort of mark up front how you're going to be using that word. Another set of words, genetic engineering, synthetic biology, engineering biology. These are very similar, but not the same words. And you know, if you use them, you need to say how you intend to use them. And similarly, biotechnologies, genetically engineered organisms, you know, GMOs, products of biotechnology. These terms all mean something similar, but you'll have to choose, you know, the term you want and kind of stick with it, you know, define what you mean and try to be all of these by being specific about what you're talking about and defining your terms. That is a really important way to be clear and concise so that somebody won't be confused when you know, go from one thing to the next in your kind of, when you're building your argument. And I think, is that the last one? Did I have one more, or is that it?
I think that was all.
Perfect.
Yeah. But I think, you know, this is just goes to show, like, when you're talking about and when you're writing articles for this special issue, just be thinking about, you know, the terms you're using, you know, and to also, you know, how you can be as clear as possible when you're writing. And this is just one example of that, especially in a field kind of as diverse as the bioeconomy. All right. So also these are found on our website. So, you know, I'm not going to go through them necessarily in detail, but these are just a few writing questions to get your gears turning as you're thinking about what to write for the special issue. So first of all, on some fundamental concepts of, like, how will these emerging technologies affect local or regional economies? Are there any security risks that would emerge from these technologies? What are major uncertainties? Some of the things you could also think about are different kinds of impacts. So how will different resources and translation of these technologies affect nations in different stages of economic development, or nations with different political organizations? Also think about how different kinds of institutions can play a role in the bioeconomy. What kinds of international organizations, states, corporations, or other kinds of institutions, what role will they play in these biotechnologies? Can they help with strengthening international control or international controls, or creating new ones? You know, how will these different institutions engage with new biotechnologies? Some might be quicker to adapt to new technologies than others. And then what risk and benefits could local economies experience with implementation of biotechnologies or this industry? Another guiding question to be thinking about is building a constituency. So is there efforts that are ongoing or that you think should be started to achieve international control of technologies that may be problematic, that may face strong local or political resistance that stems from ideology and or economic interests? And then also, what kind of strategies are most likely to counter this resistance? Or, you know, are there cases where this resistance needs to be acknowledged and addressed? Let's see. So scale up. This is something that is a really big issue, I know, here in the US when we're thinking about bioeconomy, is how do we scale up the production and development of these new technologies? Performing a experiment in a laboratory setting is much different than trying to produce a product on a manufacturing or commercial scale. Are there innovations in biomanufacturing? So that scale up piece in the biotech economy that needs to happen. And then what barriers exist in scaling up these technologies? And then building capacity. So as we build, training mechanisms for the next generation to advance these kinds of innovations, how can we develop a workforce for the bioeconomy? Who are the stakeholders in this field, and how can they be addressed in new or more effective ways? So these are all some questions to be thinking about. Like I said, they're on our website in the press release for the announcement of this new issue. So I highly recommend you take a look as you are thinking about the articles that you want to write. So a bit of reading and resources. So I know Emily talked a little bit about the technical roadmaps, and I wanted to give you a platform here to talk a little more about them.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks. So I mentioned this already, but I'll kind of say it again. EBRC puts out these technical research roadmaps, which are really, they're written by the community. Most recently, we released a Engineering Biology for Space Health roadmap that's all about using engineering biology and biotechnologies to keep humans alive and healthy in space. And we had over 100 contributors from the engineering biology and space exploration research communities, including many students and postdocs and early career trainees, including many who I've noticed are participating in this call. So that's awesome. These roadmaps, the space one being the most recent, really, again, are looking at the different opportunities for development of engineering biology tools and technologies, or the application of those technologies and engineered organisms and other mechanisms to impact everyday life and big societal challenges like climate change. How do we engineer microbiomes? Thinking about maybe, engineering human microbiomes for better health or something along those lines. And so the roadmaps that EBRC puts out looks at the technology advancements necessary over a period of time to anticipate some of those applications and those solutions. And really what it is just it's just some ideas. It's just a lot of opportunities, some really innovative and creative opportunities for that technology development that is available. And so if you're thinking about, what might the bioeconomy look like in 20 or 30 years, you might look to the roadmaps to see what are the big goals or the big breakthrough capabilities that are kind of imagined in some of these roadmaps, and as a reflection of what the broader research and industry is kind of thinking about in terms of what's ahead for us in the future. And so you might look to the roadmaps as a resource for you in thinking about what you want to write for this call in terms of, where are the opportunities or what kind of impacts might the biotechnologies have in economics or for big societal challenges.
That's great. So I definitely highly recommend, if you are thinking of submitting for this special issue, go to the EBRC website and check out their technical roadmaps, especially if the bioeconomy may be something that's a little new to you. It can be a really great resource. A few other resources, and these are also listed on the press release for this special issue, so you can check them out there. Then in the U.S., there was this report to the president on biomanufacturing to advance the bioeconomy. There is also this report that was put out on engineering biology metrics and technical standards for the global bioeconomy, so looking at it from a global scale. We have the National Academies of the Science and Engineering and Medicine here in the U.S. put out this consensus study report on safeguarding the bioeconomy. And then also OECD put out this report of meeting policy challenges for a sustainable bioeconomy. So these can all be some resources to check out, especially if this might be a new field for you. And then the full list, like I said, is on the website. So a little bit also just keep an eye out. We're going to be having this, so we have this policy writing workshop today, science policy writing workshop today. And then we are going to be having 2 panels coming up in the coming weeks of policy and governance for a sustainable bioeconomy and how technological advances in engineering biology and are pushing policy boundaries. So keep an eye out and for the announcements of those events. And then also, reach out to us at JSPG if you have any questions while you're writing. If you are interested in seeing how you can get involved, we would love to hear from you. And I'm going to end my slideshow there. And I'm going to start to turn it over to our participants. But first, let me check the chat first, since I have not been able to see the chat while I was presenting. All right. All right, so it looks like most of the questions have been answered in there. So I'm going to move over to some Q&A with our panelists here. And I encourage you, I have some questions I'm going to start out with, but we would really love to hear from folks in the audience. If you have questions for our panelists, if you have questions about the special issue, about the bioeconomy, or about science policy writing more broadly, we would love to hear from you. So please, while I'm asking these questions, be considering what you might like to ask our panelists here. I think to start, I'd want to turn it over to you guys to see, of kind of that really brief introduction we gave to the bioeconomy. Is there anything that you think you would really want the audience here to know about, or kind of build off of what was discussed in the presentation?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I think there's a really good presentation, a really good overview of science writing more generally, and also just some of the issues in the bioeconomy. There's just a couple of things that I see a lot first, let me say that I do work with the Federation of American Scientists, including with Nazish Jeffrey, who is supposed to be on this call, but couldn't make it at the last minute. But one of the things that FAS does, and I wish Nazish were here to tell more about this particular process, is they support the development of what's called Day 1 memos. And that's another sort of opportunity for people at all career stages, especially scientists, to write in a sort of a structured policy framework about a problem, a challenge, a solution that they have. But what that means is that I have seen a lot of sort of very rough Day 1 memo ideas come across my desk. And some of the sort of pitfalls that I see in those submissions fall into a couple of categories. One of them is the scope. Sometimes it's really hard to tell how big an issue is or how big it should be, and the solution space really needs to match the identified challenge. And I think that can be really difficult. And that the part of the question in the policy sense is, does this issue fit within an existing agency or an existing program or an existing other kind of structure? Is the issue, is it a US government issue, or would local government be better? Or is it an international issue that really needs to be addressed at that scale? I will say that in bio has a particular challenge because bio touches everything. Bio, it is part of the Department of Energy. It is part of the Department of Agriculture. It is, health related. It's all those things, which makes it, I think, especially challenging in the biospace to figure out how to fit these things together. And I think causes a particular challenge for people trying to enter the policy space here. But I think that is one of the key challenges that I have seen people face. A second challenge that I've seen is that people will often be like, oh, there's this risk or there's this, thing that's coming up and something should be done, and sometimes they'll be like, oh, that should be regulated. But that word regulated means something very specific in policy circles. Regulation, oversight, requirements, funding requirements, voluntary guidance, all of those things are totally valid and really good ways to address a problem. So you don't just need to say government should mandate, X. You can say, oh, we should develop guidance that helps industry figure these things out. A good example of this there's some things that are, I work a lot on biosecurity. So there are places in biosecurity we say, oh, there's a risk there. There should be a mandate that somebody, look at it or prevent it. But really, there's a lot of different places where voluntary guidance is extremely helpful, like for standards development, for example, for, biomanufacturing, for, standards in many different kinds of contexts. But there's a lot of different ways that you can do that. The third thing that I will just point out really quickly is that there are kind of two different types of challenges you can try to address. Sometimes people just say, all right, we just need more money, more money, more money. And, but it's helpful if you have a model for what that kind of money or funding would look like. Is it just going to be a new program that supports some scientific endeavor? We have a lot of models for that, a lot of, NSF, NIH, other things that'll just give money to a program. But there's also, public-private partnerships. There's, BioMade, the EBRC is a public-private partnership as well. There are programs that just provide subsidies to different kinds of, technologies or to different kinds of approaches. There are also, in bio, there's been a lot of tech hubs recently, and a lot of interest in these sort of tech hubs that from the Economic Development Administration, for example, and even from NSF. And those are all like really good models. And if you really want, to get to convince somebody that your approach is feasible and a good idea, it's great to say, oh yeah, I want something like this, but focused on this and partnered with, Z, whatever it is. So I think that maybe I'll stop there and see if there's any, questions about that. Well, actually, all right, I said there were two different kinds of things. One is funding. The second one is smaller and no direct funding kinds of projects or solutions. So those would be solutions that are like better coordination, and that can be coordination within the US government. It can be better coordination internationally, ideas about, what kinds of successful engagements we should be engaging in. And those other sort of very little or no direct funding things can be changes in requirements or regulations or approaches from agencies that are not just dump a whole lot more money into the, into the system. So I think that if you figure out what your solution space is going into the writing, I think that can really help you be clear and concise in what the challenge is and what you're trying to achieve.
So Sarah, we did have a question come up in the chat asking when you were talking about voluntary guidance, and this question is from Carolyn Chapman. Carolyn, would you like to ask it, or I'm happy to read off of the chat too?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much. I think this is so interesting. You mentioned that there's different type, if you just throw out regulations, there's different types of ways that you act, more specific terminology that you might want to use. And I always thought that this issue of, the FDA, for example, is a space I work in, always has, guidance, so much guidance documents. But if you actually read the technical, if you get into the details, the devil's in the details, it always says that this is, these are recommendations that, unless otherwise noted, where there might be citing some regulations. But at the same token, my sense is that most companies follow the recommendations because ultimately the FDA has sort of the teeth in the approval of a product. But I'm wondering in other areas, I still wonder about that because they don't necessarily have to follow, but in other areas where there's not, sort of a regulatory endpoint, I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's something I think about a lot, actually. And one of the frameworks that I'm most familiar with is it was with DNA synthesis screening. So this is a framework that says that, the big commercial DNA providers like IDT or Twist, when they get an order of DNA, they screen the DNA sequence to see if it matches pathogen or toxin DNA. And if it does, then they follow up with the customer to make sure that the customer has a legitimate use for it. And there's been a lot of interest in this framework lately, but for the past, 15 years, it's been strictly voluntary. It was guidance developed by the US government. And to me, it's been a very effective framework, in part because it spurred a lot of, companies, they want to be responsible. in the FDA space, I know that a lot of the guidance is explicitly guidance on how to best follow the regulation. And so it's definitely in their immediate self-interest, to make sure that they follow it as well as possible. But even in the case of like these DNA providers, they want to be responsible. They want to do their due diligence. They want to avoid liability. There's all kinds of reasons, of good self-interested reasons, why they would want to make sure that their DNA is not misused to cause harm. But what the guidance allowed them to do is it allowed the companies, it helped the companies to come together to say, okay, we have a common problem. How do we best do this screening? What does it even mean for a sequence to be flagged, as a potential sequence of concern? And so they were able to work together, and they developed, different kinds of practices. They compared those practices. They developed best practices. And once those best practices became really established in that community, it became possible to later move to like a regulatory, type framework. We're not there yet, but there are now funding requirements where institutions that receive funding from the US government are supposed to now buy DNA only from companies that screen. But to me, it's all part of kind of the same spectrum, where you have to, the voluntary guidelines can be very effective on their own, but that it's also kind of it can help to develop those norms that are then easier to instill, to develop incentives for, including, in an extreme case, regulation that can be much more effective and have a lot more teeth. The last thing I'll say about that is that voluntary guidance, that's something that you can also call for internationally. There is no international body, or very few international bodies, that can establish a regulation and make people do it. But if you develop that voluntary guidance, you can work on developing the best practices and instilling that norm, and it can still be a very valuable framework that can extend, internationally, even if it's required in some places, fully regulated in others, and not at all addressed in other places.
Thank you so much. That's so helpful, and it helps me broadly with just even thinking about all these things. But I think, your point about it's helpful standalone, but then also may also contribute to an evolution over time. And that's bringing up to mind, like the comments on the guidance. The FDA, for example, they'll put out draft guidance first, then they'll have comments, then they'll put out a guidance, and you can always submit comments about, so it's constant feedback too. So that's really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I see we have a question in the chat from Ricardo. And before we move on to your question, Ricardo, I wanted to follow up with Emily and Julietta on just like if there's anything that you would like to really add on to, what we talked about earlier, or also if you have any recommendations or advice for people who might be thinking about submitting articles for the journal.
Sure, I can add, and then we can go to Julietta if she has anything. Sarah kind of ended before the question from Carolyn about, she said clear and concise. And I had a note I had already written about that really when you are thinking about writing a policy memo, especially as scientists, we want to put a lot of data into it. We want put a lot of information out there, but sometimes it's better to just be kind of short and be kind of just try to be as clear and concise and recognize that sometimes writing for policy is really more about starting a conversation rather than directly impacting, policy or a regulation or guidance directly. It may just be really about, bringing something to more collective attention so that more people will be able to talk about it. And so sometimes you can be really clear and concise with bringing up a topic or even making your own recommendations, and that really just serves as a starting point for further conversation.
That's great. And Julietta, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I definitely agree with everything that Sarah and Emily have said. From someone who's a little bit newer to life science policy writing, I think it's important to find a balance, or maybe not a balance, but maybe this is something that Sarah and Emily could address too, between what's your opinion versus what's more evidence-based facts that you're putting into your memo or your paper. Like where, I guess, more of a question, where is that line drawn and what do you recommend in that sense?
Yeah, I'll say yeah, to me, that's a really hard one to do. And I think it's becoming more difficult for me as I get more opinionated, I guess, or experienced maybe is the right way to say that. But to me, one thing that for my bigger projects, the things that I'm really going to hang my hat on in the long run, that'll be a year long or a 2-year long engagement. One thing that I really make sure to do in any sort of policy paper like that is that I talk to, I try to figure out who all the stakeholders are, who is anybody that has an opinion or, has some interface with that question. And I try to talk to those people and see what they say and see how they think about that problem. Or that issue. And, and if I'm trying to figure out recommendations or options, I'll ask them, what do they think? This idea has come up. What do you think of that idea? And I try to talk to enough people that I have convinced myself that I have visibility on all the different issues that are going to come up. And I think that to me, that's like a true policy process, is that kind of like stakeholder engagement, the back and forth. I know that for this kind of, this kind of submission that we're working on, that you might be working on, that people might be working on for this article, you won't have a chance to do that kind of thing. But it's a very helpful exercise just to think through all of those different perspectives and what those different perspectives might think about the different parts of the challenge.
All right, I want to go to some of the audience questions that we have. So I'll start with Ricardo because he put his in first in the chat, and then we'll move on to folks who had their hands raised. So Ricardo, would you like to ask your question in person, or I'm happy to read it? Okay. So yeah, Ricardo said he would be interested in hearing any recommendations on existing successful or unsuccessful citizen participation mechanisms that are bridging society and policy making. He says he's also exploring how to build more in-depth democratization of biotechnology through grassroots approaches.
I guess I can take a first crack at that. I know that in Europe, they have had some actual councils where they've tried to engage the public in the sort of science technical issues with policy angles. And I don't remember what those are called. I was just trying to Google them actually, but there's like some sort of councils, maybe Emily, knows more about them. The only other helpful thing I can say is that some of the models that we have in the US have been very unsuccessful, including just, public participation or requests for information that the agencies send out, for example, the EPA or, USDA, or different regulatory agencies will, request information on horizon scanning or on, what they should do about this, type of technology. And, those requests for information, they're necessary and they do get some good information, but they can also just be totally co-opted, by people that have strong opinions, but not a lot of, expertise and people that don't bring much new to the table. And so there's been a lot of challenges in that way. It's the agencies with the US government in general is very constrained in the ways that it's allowed to collect input from the public, which is a major challenge, in my opinion, especially in bio.
Yeah, I will just add to that. I don't, I know what Sarah's talking about, and I don't remember exactly what they're called either. And I was looking the same to see if I find it, but I know that the EU in particular does have some of those mechanisms to bring society into the policy making and decision making process, especially on the bioeconomy. They've got I know in particular, they have bioeconomy youth ambassadors that participate in some of the EU policymaking. Would really echo what a lot of Sarah said. I would add that, to some approaches that I've seen be successful are often successful because a lot of all of the participants kind of agree to maybe the broad end term goal. They all have the same mission at heart and in mind, and it's just the process of getting there that there might be some disagreements, and they can go back and forth on that. But often the successful attempts are through those who can kind of agree on the same mission or the same big goal at the end, whereas the unsuccessful ones are often where their end view might fully diverge, and so they have less of a process there. And also just generally, I think that to participate in democratic science policy activities, as Sarah said, it's really just important to try to hear from lots of different audiences to be able to, it's not always possible to get to consensus, but if you can demonstrate enough voices in the process and enough different viewpoints, you can see how a policy can be made that's accessible to most people.
That's great. Thank you. I see we have a hand raised from Cholpazit.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks for walking through the process. That's very interesting. So I have a question about the conflict of interest. So when we write a scientific paper, there will be some conflict of interest. Let's say we use something from a particular company, we have to like declare that. But this kind of policy paper, I think like the conflict of interest may exist a lot, especially if we are addressing some kind of policy that were initiated by one political party over the other or something like that. Like, for example, I'm planning to write something about the national like policy that was going on. And I want to make sure that like I do it properly by like addressing and mention it in a way that doesn't infringe anything. I mean, I'm happy to write the the proper wording to the actual policy, but of course there will be some kind of like relationship between the actual policy itself to those who have made the previous policy. So I just want to hear what is the general approach on writing or addressing this kind of conflict of interest.
So I think one thing I want to clarify, are you talking about like financial conflicts of interest or just like matters of, you have a certain opinion or something like that? Can you explain a little bit more what you mean by that?
Yeah, not financial, but like let's say I wanna like address on the policy that is going on that like this is not something good for the scientific community that has been happening based on the national policy that has been happening in the past 4 years, in the past elections, something like that. And this is not gonna affect like the financial situation, but it could be something that I'm positioning myself as against the like one political party that we're making that policy like practically.
Yeah, so I'm happy to, talk a little bit. Well, first of all, like all of us have opinions. And so, like having an opinion is not itself a conflict of interest. So I think, one of the things you can think of is, when you mentioned in academic papers, how you have to, cite your conflicts of interest. Quite often those are financial conflicts of interest or saying like I sit on a board for a certain company, or I have this number of shares in this company that's starting out of this field, like that sort of thing is quite often where those conflicts of interest statements come from. So, I think also, one of the things that, Sarah talked a little bit about is, like talking to lots of people who are in this field is a great way to get exposure to, when you're thinking about a policy, trying to think about what the pros and cons are of a certain policy idea that you have. What other kinds of points of view there might be from someone who might hold a different opinion. All of that can be really informative in helping to shape it. But I open it up to the floor on the panelists on how they would like to respond.
Yeah, one thing for example, one thing I've been writing a lot about lately is risks that arise at the convergence of AI and biosecurity. And, and there's a huge range of viewpoints about that risk. And it's, some people don't see it at all, and others think it's, going to be catastrophic and, very urgent. And I think one way to address that is just to acknowledge the range of viewpoints about it, and you don't have to agree with every viewpoint, but you can say, some people, I know that some people say this, for this reason and this reason, but I believe this, for this reason, and therefore, Like, I think that kind of acknowledgement, I think, goes a long way. It at least lets people know that you're not just, in a box by yourself, fully in an echo chamber. And I think that that's, an important, first step.
If I could just add into something on that. I was just thinking that also noting the difference between maybe the policy that you're thinking about and the politics. And so making sure that you're addressing the policy issue, even if you feel really passionately about it, and even if it affects you in a personal way. And I would say that even if those things are true, that's not necessarily a conflict. It may be a bias that you would want to disclose. But on the other hand, your reasoning for that, your motivation for that, or your experience with it might be something that is actually, if framed properly, is a persuasive part of that. But again, like making sure that what you're presenting is about the policy. It's not about this political party, opposing that way necessarily. It's about this policy idea. And then I just wanted to sneak in another comment that's kind of related. When Sarah was talking about the importance of talking to all the different kinds of stakeholders, I think another part of that that's really, and partly because you can see opposing views as well, but I think it's also knowing that some of these issues maybe have been worked on in one form or another for a while. And so you can find real champions and other people who have been working on this. And so when you go talk to them about their opinions or the work that they'd already done or how they'd been thinking about it, they can be really excited to know that a early career scientist cares about this and can help them, in what they've been doing. And there's somebody else that wants to do that. So talking with other stakeholders is, I think, a really great thing, both to get the depth of difference of opinion, but also for those that might share some of the same motivators or care about those projects.
That's some really excellent input. Thank you so much, India. Lucas, I see your hand up. I'd love to hear what your question is.
Hi, first, thanks to the organizers and the guests here. This is really fun. I appreciate your time and energy. I guess I have sort of a procedural question. It might be perhaps a little unfairly vague, but I'm hoping you can help me out a little bit. It relates to kind of transitioning from an idea or slant down to the actual writing, if that makes sense. So as an example, let's say you wanted to write about how there should be improved access mechanisms for like talented immigration for bioeconomy related fields, right? So you have that idea, you have a slant that you feel strongly about. What's the next step to kind of developing a full picture that can then be put into an actual finished writing piece? Because, okay, maybe for my science, I go on Google Scholar, but that is not quite as clear cut for a policy.
That's a really great question, Lucas. I think, and this is, this would be my own approach. I think that there's probably a lot of different approaches to kind of getting over that hump that you said of between I have a great idea, how do I prove it? How do I communicate that? For me, sometimes it's looking at, and just like with looking at other data that exists in a scientific context, what currently happens. So what is the current situation, and what about that maybe works or doesn't work, and how might you tackle then or how might you change what doesn't work to assess, to refine that into what works. And so it could be, I want to get to this endpoint. And here's where I'm starting with and figuring out, where are the speed bumps along that road, and how do I shave them down while maintaining the stuff that does work in the process. it is, I think I think we would all agree that and recognize that what you're talking about here is a challenge, and especially coming to perhaps science policy writing for the first time is really getting to that point. I'm sure that, you know, Sarah's got tons of experience with this as well. Probably has her own approach to add.
No, I mean, it is hard, and there's a particular challenge, because if you just go into like they're writing, you know, the existing literature is not as accessible, you know, and so there's, you know, you can just Google it, and there are, you know, publications that publish policy stuff, but like a lot of the projects that I have done have not been, you know, like published. It's not been peer-reviewed journals in the same way. We've gone, you know, I've published several big reports, for example, with the Nuclear Threat Initiative that, you know, we did very rigorously, but just, you know, they were published by NTI. It was not in a, you know, a journal. And so it can be hard to figure out who that, you know, where those resources are. And this is one thing that I found out when I moved to Washington and started doing this, you know, professionally, is that you need to, this is why it's important, and why in policy people talk to people. You know, they email somebody, you know, they call them up, they say, who else should I talk to? You know, that's like the required ending question for every kind of policy, you know, research. You know, you say, oh, who else should I talk to? And eventually you'll figure out where those pots of really good resources are. And I think that's, if for people in Washington, just kind of a, you know, unsolicited tip, if you're interested in a topic, you should go to go to any events that are related to that, you know, at the National Academies or anywhere else. But in addition to whatever the panel is or whatever the topic is and whoever is presenting, it's the people in the room that are going to be by far the best resources for you. And figure out who is there, why they're there, what their different perspectives might be like, and that's going to be where you're going to get the most information about that topic, and about who cares about that topic, and about who is written about that topic. And I think that you know, that's something I always tell like early career people, especially when they're going to be in Washington, is to go see in person, you know, who else wants to be at that table.
I will add, as I was already now early in my career, Sarah was one of those people that I went to, and I was like, I'm trying to learn about this topic. But yes, others from the audience, do we have any other questions for our panelists?
I'll just add really quickly on that one question I just asked. Another thing that means in the policy community is that if you do just cold email, like when I was a grad student, I never would just cold email anybody. I thought that was like the weirdest thing in the world, and I like was against all of my own personal social norms. But I have now learned that yes, you can just cold email somebody. And if they don't email you back, it's not because they think you're an idiot and shouldn't have emailed. It's because they were busy that day and forgot to flag the email to follow up later, and it fell off their inbox, and they, you know, like forgot about it. And, you know, and that's okay. You know, you can email that person again the next week and see, you know, if they, you know, can engage. And it's not, you know, it's not unusual in policy circles for that to happen.
I can only echo that. It's totally, I send a lot of very cold emails. And I don't know that more than 20% of them are successful. So sometimes you gotta try again and again and be persistent, but not too much of a pest. But yeah, it does kind of go against the norm for a scientist, but for policy people, cold emails are really common. Do it.
Can second that.
I just wanted to add to that too. I'm working on an independent project looking at women's health and the bioeconomy, and I've been sending out a lot of cold emails to very random people in the policy world and thinking they're never going to respond. They don't care who I am, what I'm working on. But I've had more respond than I thought, and their excitement to talk to me about what they do and the policies that are going on and their thoughts and opinions is amazing and very surprising. So I think, yeah, definitely reach out and you'll be surprised with what you find.
Absolutely. And Lucas, one part of your question I saw was also about like, where do you find sources for this kind of information? You know, you can't really go on, you know, Google Scholar necessarily. I mean, you can, but you know, you aren't going to find all the information there on this. You know, places to look are going to be like government websites. Will have information on what are existing policies. You can also look at existing law of, you know, whether it be you know, what is already in the law for a certain country of how, you know, in your case, immigration for certain kinds of fields is handled, and what kinds of you know, agency or ministry policies might be governing that. You can also look at places like think tanks, might have position papers on some of these issues, as well as you know, different groups that might be focusing on high-skilled immigration or immigration for certain kinds of scientific fields. So those are all some places you can look, in addition to, like we were saying, you know, like talking to people who are experts in this field and seeing what kinds of resources they might recommend you look at.
Yeah, I would also just say the National Academies often has, you know, projects, and they do an excellent job of, sometimes they're a little bit forward leaning, but they will definitely have a snapshot of the current, you know, conventional wisdom on whatever topic. And I think that can be really helpful. Yeah, I think that's a good place to look.
Yeah, I'll just echo or add on to that. I think that's certainly true and true of EBRC as well. If you look again at our publication page and some of the other things, like some of the issues that we're working on, kind of related to that at the academies. Yeah, if you look at their current projects, not just the reports that they've just published, but you can look at the current projects page and see what the current committees that are currently active. And so then that also gives you a little bit of idea of what some of those key issues are that are like actively being discussed. And you know, same kind of with EBRC is that those are often ones that either members in our case are interested in and want follow up and want some you know, policy action or information on, or that, you know, they care about. But it's also either for us or the academies, it means that there's somebody possibly in government that cared enough about it to ask them to do that work and then pay for it. And so it's enough of an issue and it's recognized in that way that so that can help you get some of those ideas as well.
Absolutely. So I know we are currently about a minute away. So I think with there, we can wrap up with our speakers. But first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. Sarah, Emily, and Julietta, as well as also India. Thank you for hopping on as well. So if you are interested in submitting, please check out the JSPG website on our JSPG-EBRC special issue and the submission information. We would love to have you guys submit an article and to tell us about your great ideas in bioeconomy policy. But thank you so much for joining us all. We'll be posting the recording of this soon-ish. I need to get better at it, but you know, it'll be posted to the YouTube channel. So I will let you guys get on with the rest of your afternoon, evening, or whatever time zone you are in. And thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us learning a little bit about science policy writing.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hannah.
Thanks a lot.